So what drives complexity in supply chains? Well, we can identify 5 big drivers of complexity for any system, not just supply chains. The first one is numerousness. Now this is a strange word, it doesn't really roll off my tongue, but all that it means is the more things you have, your complexity probably goes up. The greater number of suppliers, customers, products, assembly lines, orders you have will increase the complexity. Remember, solving a network design for 5 DCs is much less complex than solving one with 50 or 500. And this is what Peter Singay referred to as detail complexity. So the second driver is the variety or diversity of these different entities or components. The greater the mix of different types or distribution patterns for these variables will increase the complexity. This is similar to what we talked about when we looked at managerial accounting complexity earlier. As I have more things that are different from each other, they're not all just the same, then that'll make things much more complex because now I have to handle them in different ways. The third driver is interconnections and interactions, and this is the interconnection interactions between those entities. So the greater the number of connections I have between the different parameters, processes, and variables will increase the complexity. For example, if I have shared resources that are being shared between divisions, things will get complex since the actions of one division will impact the other division and vice versa. So having more things that are different, that variety or diversity, and if they're connected, not just independent, but if there are some connections between them, the complexity just keeps increasing. The fourth driver is the opacity of interactions. So what does opacity mean? Essentially it means it's not transparent. So the less that is known about the nature of the interactions between the entities, the greater the complexity. A lot of times people don't even see that there's an interconnection or any kind of interaction. So for example, I did some work with a company a little while ago that would run promotions on very short notice, and this would require significant demand for trucks that they had not planned for. Now while their carriers, their vendors, would comply with this last minute request, usually at a higher cost because it was out of what they originally had planned, then this actually ended up stealing resources from another part of the same company that had been planning to use those trucking assets. So essentially, what happened here is there was an interaction that they didn't even see, and they paid for it twice by paying for higher fees for both ends. The fifth driver is the dynamic effects, and this is where a small perturbation in a system can create larger disturbances elsewhere in the system. We saw this when we looked at the bullwhip effect in a previous course, where we looked at a little bit of demand change in diapers would bullwhip its way back all the way to the raw materials, and it would increase the variability of demand. And we'll look at this again in a later lesson. So you might ask, okay, complexity, it looks bad. This is back to the first thing we said in this whole lesson. Why do I care? Well, complexity is there for a reason. No one adds it for complexity's sake. No one wakes up in the morning and say, let's make my supply chain more complex, because that's fun. What happens is, if you want to increase your profitability, you're probably going to inadvertently increase complexity, and you need to be aware of that. So let's look at the drivers of profitability. On a very simplistic basis, if I want to increase my profitability, I can do it in 4 ways. I can increase the amount of money I get per unit. I can increase the number of people buying it, the market share. I can increase the number of units sold. That could be the number of units per each customer. Or I could decrease the cost per unit. So what we're saying here is, implicit to every strategy or action intended to improve the profitability, there is some hidden cost here for complexity. And what we want to make sure is that you capture this, you're cognizant of it, and you're aware of it. And then we'll talk about what you can do to deal with it. So what I have here on this chart are the profitability drivers on the left in green, and any strategy will translate into some of the complexity drivers. And I just have the first 3 listed here. And so let's go through some simple examples. So first one, suppose I'm a consumer packaged good manufacturer and I make widgets and I want to change some of my packaging. Why would I do this? Well, the idea is that maybe I will attract more customers. Maybe I want to change, instead of a 4-pack, I'm going to sell my widgets in a 7-pack because I think that'll drive sales. I might attract more customers, and I might attract, hopefully more total sales. So by doing this, that's going to increase my complexity. How? Well, one, it's going to introduce a new SKU, because usually every SKU is based off a package type. So now I have a 4-pack and a 7-pack. So I now have more SKUs, and we know that the demand for each one will probably be less, so I have a smaller base, so therefore my forecasting accuracy has gone down. This is what numerousness does. Also, by having a 4-pack and a 7-pack, what is this doing? This might have some other variety issues. Does it take longer for my machines to pack a 7-pack versus a 4-pack? Does it have some packaging or some transportation implications? Can manufacturing even handle this? So now I might have to handle them differently. So think of activity-based costing. 7-pack might take a little more resources, so I'm adding even more complexity here. So to get those benefits for the increased profitability, I am adding some complexity. And the question is it worth it? That's what we really want to get down to. Okay, another quick example. I'm a retailer and I have both online sales and traditional brick and mortar stores. And I usually have separate DCs. What if I open a joint one? So now I will serve customers for online as well as replenishing my stores from the same facility. Why would I do this? Well, it's a strategy, and it's usually to reduce costs because you figure it's a fixed resource. I can use the same people. My cost per unit should go down. Okay, so what does this add for complexity? This is really going to increase the amount of interactions that you have, because now what I do for the online replenishment will influence and impact what I can do for the retail or traditional replenishment. So I've introduced a lot of complexity. Is it worth it? Don't know. Got to look at it. But by doing this drive to improve profitability, there are inherent complexity drivers that are being introduced. So where does this complexity enter the supply chain? Interestingly, it usually comes through the ends, not through the supply chain itself. So when I say the ends, we can think of it on the left side as when new products get introduced. I write that here as research and development. And on the other side, it's the marketing and sales. So what do I mean by research and development introducing complexity? Well, whenever new products are introduced, there's usually a desire for unique and special components within that product. Call this the engineer's conceit. For example, I once worked with a company where the engineers had designed unique power units, power cords, for each product instead of adopting a common one. And we know that this reduces the amount of modularity I have, makes it harder to have postponement, and it increases some of the supply chain costs. And so this introduces complexity because it's introducing the greater number of intermediate SKUs to be managed and forecast. This happens all the time. At the other end is marketing and sales. And what do they want? They really want to have a wide and diverse product portfolio. Their job is to make sure that no customer demand falls through the cracks. They have a product for everyone. What does this do to the supply chain complexity? Well, it increases the number of final product SKUs that need to be handled. And we know that that increases the forecasting variability and all those other factors that we looked at. So the complexity really, interestingly, comes in from the ends, and the supply chain has to deal with it. So why do I bring this up? It's not to make fun of the research and development or the marketing and sales guys. It's because complexity entering through the ends of the supply chain, it implies that any initiative to look at the reduction of complexity, mainly in the number of SKUs or the type of SKUs, they should always involve people from marketing and sales and from the new product development or the R&D process. They need to be involved or else that initiative is probably doomed. So they need to be engaged since the greatest source of complexity comes from their needs and their requirements. Okay, one last thing I want to do in this segment, and this is a nice tool that I've come across, and it's the idea of mapping the complexity fingerprint of any company or any supply chain. And the idea is that I'm going to look at my supply chain or a set of business, and I want to identify the different drivers, the number of different drivers that are there. So in this example I have on the slide, you count the number of technologies, and I see 10, the number of packaging types I use, the number of SKUs, the number of brands, and the number of customers. Then you count the number that contribute to 80% of the earnings before interest and taxes. So these are where the lion's share of those earnings coming from. And you count for each of those how many technologies are present in those, how many of the packaging types are in those. And so you go through and then you look at the percentage. And what does this do? This helps kind of flag or help you focus in on where you might want to dive in to some more complexity reduction or just take a look at what's happening. For example, for customers, in this case, only 10% of the customers contribute to that 80% EBIT that I talked about. Now, these thresholds of 80% or 90% or 85%, yes, they're arbitrary, but the powerfulness of this tool is that it helps you focus. So, okay, I covered a lot of ground here in this video. And so we talked about complexity, we talked about the drivers of complexity, and what I want to do next is talk about a couple examples of what companies did when they looked at the complexity of their supply chain and their operations.